people who've come from far away. It was great at our C function last night to see all the international students and remember what a huge influence they were on our class, and now see what a huge influence Sloan is having throughout the world. A couple of administrative matters. There is space available for several workshops and programs during the flex time this afternoon from 2:30 to 5. So there's information downstairs on that. This session is being recorded and will be shared on the school's website during the course of the summer. And for the purpose of those recordings, it's imperative that when we get to the question and answer session of the program, identify yourself and use the microphone to ask your question. As I think about our speaker today, I'm reminded of a brief and almost terse conversation I had with my thesis advisor after I had gone into the field and collected a lot of information from entrepreneurs and how they had been, whether they'd been successful or unsuccessful in fundraising. I had all my notes and notes of all my conversations and a little bit of data, and I asked him what I should do, and he said, basically, good God, man, it's MIT, you've got to do the analysis. And so our speaker today has been doing the analysis his whole career. His research specialty is applied mathematical modeling with a focus on problems of health and safety. His early work on homicides was presented to Gerald Ford at the White House, and his analysis of U.S. casualties in Vietnam was the subject of a column by William F. Buckley. He received the President's Award and the Expository Writing Award from the Institute for Operations Research and Management Sciences in 1996 and in 2001. He's been called the nation's leading expert on aviation safety, and in 2002 received the President's Citation from the Flight Safety Foundation for truly outstanding contributions on behalf of safety. And with all the news lately about air traffic controllers, I'm wondering if he's going to have to redo his research to figure out the probability of your air traffic controller falling asleep and what that might do to your safe completion of your flight. So I'll turn it over to Arnold Barnett. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, how do I get the... good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Wow, it's good to see you back. And you see, now we have a new building. You suffered in the old days, but now we have this. And we're really very lucky because the construction started in 2007, 2008, before the financial crisis hit. And had we been a year later, it could be that a financial problem would have prevented our being here today. So it's wonderful to see you, and I want to welcome you back. We'll try to get you some sunshine this afternoon, but I think you understand that the words that seem to characterize Boston most are mostly cloudy. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, so let's talk. Now, it is true that there have been some air traffic controllers who slept recently. If you feel like dozing during the presentation, go right ahead. You have your degree, you've earned it, so let me see now. I want to talk today, though, about some mortality risks, and indeed, I want to allude a little bit to some of the points that were made in that generous introduction about the things, yes, we certainly have heard a lot about sleeping air traffic controllers, and that may be part of the problem. But anyway, the talk is titled Some Mortality Risks. You know, I gave that title, which when you think about it is rather vague, because I was asked for a title just after the terrible tragedy in Japan of the earthquake, when it was not known what would be the consequences of the problems with the nuclear reactors. In fact, it's still not known for sure, but that was, I didn't know whether I would speak about that. Of course, I don't know anything particularly about nuclear reactors, but as you may know, here in Cambridge, you don't really have to know anything to pontificate about it. But I chose that title, and I won't discuss nuclear power today, except perhaps fleetingly toward the end. Instead, I'll talk about some subjects about which I have worked for a long time. Okay, and so we'll talk about mortality risks. Now, we'll talk about them even better if I can... wait, already we have an emergency. Oh, this is it. I see. Excuse me. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we'll start out with a topic on which I've worked, aviation safety. And you know, in a way, I'm very, very lucky in terms of that topic. The reason I started it, it was twofold. Firstly, I was a little bit afraid to fly, and I thought, let me look at the statistics and try to comfort myself. But secondly, I was a young academic here, and I was thinking, how can I sublimate my fears in a way that might be publishable? And so I started doing data analyses on this subject, and it turns out that there are a lot of people who are interested in flying. And let's talk a little bit about how safe it is to fly now. And you know, that raises a question immediately. How should we measure aviation safety? Metrics are extraordinarily important, as you doubtless know, in your work. And sometimes metrics are advanced without their strengths and weaknesses being fully explored. So let's talk about that. You know, I get emails. One of the consequences of our being in an information age is that it's very easy for people you don't know to contact you. And here's one I got. My name is LS. There was actually a name there, but I'm leaving it out. I would like to know if you, as an expert in aviation safety, fly regularly. You see, I stopped flying about a year ago, and this has affected my life in a significant manner. Just one last question. What are the odds of me dying in a plane crash? And I remember someone I know at American Airlines said, well, if she doesn't fly, the answer is obviously 0. But in any case, let's consider, though, how many of you flew to get here today? Oh, my goodness, that's wonderful. But in any case, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the risks that you took, and I guess in theory you're taking on the way back. Now, oh, I can see we're going to have quite a morning. I mean, the mortality risk will bring a jovial response. Look, what I take from what was said was something commonsensical, that given that a passenger's greatest fear is of being killed in a plane crash, there's a natural interest in statistics about the likelihood of that outcome. But which statistics are the most informative? You know, there are many metrics out there, but are they satisfactory for the purpose? Here's one, for example, a quote from the Wall Street Journal. NTSB, meaning the National Transportation Safety Board, studies show that from 93 through 96, scheduled U.S. carriers had only 0.2 fatal accidents per 100,000 flight hours. So there is a metric there, fatal accidents per 100,000 flight hours. Now, I see two problems with that statistic, namely the numerator and the denominator. What are the problems? The generic term fatal accident blurs the distinction between a crash that kills one passenger out of 300 and another that kills all 300. And I mean, if we had to be on one of those planes, wouldn't we rather be on the one with only one fatality instead of everyone? And yet they were both counted as fatal accidents, counted equally. Moreover, measuring activity by flight hours misses the point that in terms of accidents, the overwhelming bulk occur on landing or takeoff. In fact, statistically, the landing is a little bit more dangerous than the takeoff, which was always a problem for me because I would always think that no matter how well the flight was going, the risk was still ahead. But in any case, because of this, the numerator and the denominator being difficult, I don't like that statistic. Now here's one that, not surprisingly, Boeing came up with. Hull losses per 100,000 departures. In other words, what is a hull loss? It's essentially the equivalent of totaling a car. The plane simply can't be used again because of the accident. And, you know, if it certainly is relevant, I can understand why Boeing would be interested in it. But let me just give some examples. If we're really talking about the mortality risk of air travel, hull losses can mean enormously different things. And let me just consider two hull losses that not only occurred in 2005, but in the same month, August of that year. An Air France Airbus 340 had a terrible landing during stormy weather at Toronto. The plane ultimately was destroyed in a conflagration, and yet all the passengers and all the crew survived. That same month, because of a failure of the pressurization system, a Helios Airlines 737 crashed near Athens, killing everyone on board. Both of those count as hull losses. Yet in terms of the mortality risk of air travel, I don't think they're necessarily equivalent. So I would rather have a statistic that more directly relates to mortality than to something that is at best a poor proxy for it. But then you might say, well, look, what about passengers killed to passengers carried? That is a ratio. It sort of is something like the probability you would be killed and how many were killed out of how many. It's simple. So why not simply use that? Well, actually, I think there is a reason. And that is the following. Suppose a 737 hits a mountain, killing all the passengers. You know, the implications about the safety of flying would seem to be the same, regardless of whether it's completely full or only a third full. And yet in one case, the number killed might be 150. In another case, the number killed might be 50. And treating the two outcomes as very different doesn't seem to me to be relevant from the point of view of safety. At the same time, if you have 28 people killed, well, is it 28 out of 28 or 28 out of 280? In the latter case, the 90% survival rate might reflect excellent emergency procedures. And I wouldn't want to treat that as irrelevant, you know, in an assessment about the safety of air travel. In other words, when you look at passengers killed as the numerator, it may be subject to irrelevant fluctuations in the fraction of seats occupied and insensitive to salient variations in the percentage of passengers saved, the survival rate. So I'd rather not do that. You might say, well, you're going to spend the whole morning telling us about all the statistics you don't like. Well, actually, I could. But let's move on to something else. Here is a statistic that I think is preferable, not perfect, but preferable. Death risk per randomly chosen flight. And basically, that's the answer to a simple question. If we take a particular set of flights, if a person chose at random from among them, for example, we might be focusing on Brazilian jet flights over the 1990s, what is the probability that she will not survive it for a reason related to a problem with the airplane? I mean, some people die of natural causes on planes. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about because of an accident or an act of terror. Okay? And you know, I think this statistic has conceptual advantages compared to the other statistics I just mentioned. What are these advantages? Well, for one thing, if you look at the formula, I was going to derive the formula here, but then I thought that we really would have a lot of air traffic controllers sleeping in the audience. First of all, it ignores the length and duration of flight, which are virtually unrelated to the death risk. In other words, it's one flight, one vote in some sense. The formula weights each crash by the percentage of passengers killed. So if you have a plane hitting a mountain and everyone is killed, it counts the same way whether the plane was full or half full. And it seems to me that's a more salient measure of what actually happened. It's also very easy to calculate and understand because when you think about death risk per flight, the overwhelming bulk of flights have no death risk at all. So they basically is zero is the death risk for those flights. And for those for which we do have fatalities, we can work out the percentage killed and the very small number for which there are fatalities. And so I personally prefer to use this measure. Anyway, what does this measure lead us to? Well, let me give you a number. If we look at the decade that just ended, the first decade of the 21st century, if you were to pick a flight at random anywhere in the world, a passenger flight, of course, a scheduled passenger flight, and get on it, the probability that you would have been killed is about 1 in 3 million. Okay, that's a worldwide statistic. It's jets, propellers, you know, countries of all different economic status and whatnot. That's a first number to give you, and I'll try to give you some intuition for numbers like this. The only thing is, it's a funny thing. Much as the center of mass of a bagel is the center of the whole where there is no mass. I was going to say donut, but then I realized that not so many of the donuts we eat these days have holes. But in any case, think of a bagel then, okay? And in any case, the center of mass, if you've studied physics, the average position of the mass is the middle of the whole where there is no mass. In the same way, I don't think there's one country on the earth on which the death risk itself is actually 1 in 3 million. It's an average of vastly discordant death risks. So you might say, okay, well, what about the situation here in the U.S.? I know many of you who come from overseas, and it may be distressing that the presentation is so heavily U.S.-centric, but then again, this is the way we are. So let's talk about the situation here in the U.S. Now, first of all, I want to talk to you in terms of a goal. Do you know, in the late 1990s, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, set a most ambitious safety goal. It was to reduce the fatal accident rate for scheduled U.S. aviation by 80% from the 1994 through 96 level, and that it would achieve this reduction by the year 2007. Now, I remember at the time I thought that this was a crazy goal, and you know how it came about, the way so many things come about in Washington. They originally started talking about 0 accidents, but then people say if you literally set your goal for 0 accidents, then you're almost bound not to be able to meet the goal. So therefore, they couldn't go back to 100% reduction. How they got to 80%, I don't know. Probably one person said 75%, and they said, nah, that doesn't sound big enough. And someone else said 5, 6. They said, nah, that's too complicated a fraction. So they settled probably on 80%. But there was no reason to believe you could really cut the risk by a factor of 5. I mean, you can try, of course, to reduce accidents, but a factor of 5, that's a pretty ambitious goal. Anyway, let's talk about whether or not they met it. First of all, let me give you another number. In the baseline period, 94 through 96, if you got on a U.S. plane completely at random, jet propeller, the probability that you would have been killed in the flight because of an accident, only an accident, there were no terrorist acts during that period, 1 in 3.6 million. So that's the baseline against which we're talking about the 80% reduction, at least in terms of death risk per flight. You know what happened? Well, 2007 was the time the goal was to be achieved, and there have been 4 full calendar years since then, 2007 through 2010. Do you know what the risk level was on U.S. scheduled aviation over 2007 through 10? It was 1 in 32 million. 89% lower than the 1994-96 level. So I think this is a case where we can put up the sign mission accomplished and not worry that it will create controversy. I mean, that's really an extraordinary tale of success. And in fact, there's another way of looking at it. Well, first of all, let me talk intuitively. What does it mean 1 in 32 million? You know, sometimes when people are afraid to fly, and I've met some of them, if you say, the risk is only 1 in 32 million, you know what people will say? I'll be the 1 in 32 million, okay? Which is kind of egocentric, but in any case, let's talk, though, what does it mean that you may have roughly a 1 in 32 million risk on your flight going back? And here's one way I'd like to present it recently. I presented it some other ways, which, by the way, were disastrous. I used to say you're more likely to win the lottery, the jackpot in the lottery, than to perish on your next flight. This doesn't comfort people who are afraid to fly. And you know why? Furtively, they hope to win the lottery. They don't think of it as such a remote event. And maybe it's not a great idea to juxtapose best hopes and worst fears. But anyway, here's something you might look at. President Obama is the 44th president of the U.S., and he was chosen 228 years after George Washington was first selected in 1781. Well, that works out to one president elected every 5.3 years, 228 over 43. Okay, and of course, most presidents it's either 4 or 8, but there have been exceptions to that rule, and also this is just an average. The average of the numbers doesn't have to be one of the numbers itself. Okay, you might say, why are you telling us that? Why this history lesson? Well, here's another statistic. To be president of the U.S., you must be born in this country. And over the last years for which we have natality data, there were about 4.1 million births per year in the United States. Now, over 5.3 years, how many people are born? Well, if it's 4.1 billion times 5.3 years, it's about 22 million births every 5.3 years. And if we have one president every 5.3 years, what does that mean? that means that the chance of growing up to be president is roughly 1 in 22 million. Okay, because out of every 22 million, one person becomes president. So one way of putting it is, if we were to go to Logan Airport now, an American kid at a U.S. airport today is more likely to grow up to be president than to perish in an accident on her next flight. 1 in 2 million versus 1 in 32 million. That's something, because if you say you point out to someone at the airport and say, do you think that kid's going to grow up to be president? He will say, no, of course not. But it turns out that statistically, it's more likely we have a president standing there than that something will go wrong. But that's one measure of how extraordinary a job has been done, and let's give credit to the Federal Aviation Administration and government regulators, to the airlines themselves, to the aircraft manufacturers, and also to the public and the press, which is enormously demanding in terms of the standards for safety. Because this is really an arena in which we're very close to zero tolerance, there isn't much need for tolerance. Anyway, so you should relax on your flight going back. Here's another way of looking at it. Oh, if it's 1 in 32 million per flight, if a person were to take one flight every day, Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays included, the person would on average be able to go 88,000 years before dying in an air crash. Now, you know, it's funny, this statistic comforts people who are afraid to fly because they say, 88,000 years? I'm not going to live 88,000 years. Now, you could, of course, be nasty and say, but that's only an average. But still, this is the kind of risk. When you think about it, every time we go up in a plane 7 miles above the earth, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of things that could go wrong that could kill everyone on board. And although there are all of these hazards, we have made colossal strides at dealing with them. And as I said, if only in the academic world we achieved successes remotely approximating these. But those who have achieved these triumphs deserve enormous respect on our behalf. Here's another way of looking at it. You know, I remember, I was a kid in Brooklyn in 1960 when two planes collided over New York City, one of them falling into Brooklyn, the other into Staten Island. And you know, back 1957 through 60, I looked it up. Do you know 25 passenger planes in the U.S. crashed, including the mid-air collision over New York City? 2 of those planes, by the way, were destroyed by saboteurs. Okay? A half century later, in the period we just talked about, 2007 through 10, there was only one fatal crash on a U.S. plane, and that's the one we all know about, namely the commuter plane crash near Buffalo, which led to great concerns about whether or not the pilots for these airlines were getting enough rest and getting enough training. So that's a 96% decline, 25 to 1. And I'd say it's all the more impressive because, did you know, ladies and gentlemen, Americans flew 20 times as much in 2010 as in 1960. So it's not really 25 to 1. If you multiply by 20, it's closer to 500 to 1. In other words, the accidents, at least, have been brought to the brink of extinction. And this is an enormous tribute to the people who are responsible for this. Okay? But now that we've said that, and this is, of course, something that makes us happy, you might say, what are the implications of this extraordinary success in the sky? What I'd like to do now is shift and talk a little bit about a study in which I was involved at Los Angeles International Airport, LAX. Did any of you travel here through LAX? Okay, well, I'm not allowed to land there anymore, but I'll explain. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a study about collision risk, and it has something to do with what we've just said. The North Airfield Safety Study at Los Angeles International Airport. And let me just give you a bit of background. The mayor of Los Angeles is Antonio Villaraigosa. He defeated the incumbent mayor of Los Angeles in 2005 in a campaign in which the future of LAX was one of the issues. LAX is actually owned by the city of Los Angeles and operated by Los Angeles World Airports. And during the campaign, Villaraigosa said he was opposed to reconfiguring the North Airfield of LAX, which has 2 parallel runways north of the terminals. He said the only reason he would support a reconfiguration, which would move the runways further apart, would be to ensure the safety of passengers, workers, and the surrounding community. Now, he was taking an important stand here. He was saying, I don't want to hear talk about operational efficiency or capacity. Only for safety reasons will we consider moving the runways further apart. Okay? Now, it turns out that by 2007, 5 studies had been done on the question of, do you have to move the runways further apart for safety? And all of them recommended that the spacing of the runways be increased for safety reasons. Community groups were upset about this because the moving of the runways, the North Runway 24R, would bring it closer to the communities of Westchester and Playa del Rey. And they have a long history of bitter relations with the airport. And they didn't want anything. And they said, we're not interested. The real reason people are trying to move it is for reasons of expansion, to make it easier for people from Rodeo Drive to get on the plane to Paris right away. And we've had enough of that. Now, some parties were not impressed with these studies. LA City Councilman Bill Rosendahl, who represents the districts north of the airport, described the studies as, quote unquote, irresponsible. I love that word. When you think about it, of all words you don't want for your studies, you don't want a letter in your tenure case to describe your research as irresponsible. But anyway, so what happened is, after much discussion, it was decided in 2008 to commission yet a 6th study, which it was hoped would be definitive. The North Airfield Safety Study began in that summer. An academic panel was charged with devising, monitoring, analyzing an experiment to be undertaken at Future Flight Central at NASA Ames in collaboration with NASA colleagues. Academics were chosen because there was a feeling that academics are sort of otherworldly. They don't have axes to grind. They're not attuned to what's politically savvy. So the idea was they would be sort of objective and would give us a scientific evaluation of whether or not there was a safety issue on the North Airfield. Who were the members of the academic panel? Well, I'm happy to report I was the chair. Okay, even if I weren't, I might report that I was. But in any case, the other members of the panel included, let's see, Mike Ball of Maryland, George Donahue, who had been a deputy administrator of FAA, and he is a George Mason, Mark Hansen of Transportation Engineering at Berkeley, Professor Amadeo Odoni here at MIT, my colleague and friend, Antonio Trani of Virginia Tech. All people had backgrounds in the field, math, engineering, operations research, aviation, etc. And I want to tell you a little bit about what happened. The primary aim of the study, not surprisingly, was to estimate as specifically as possible the level of future safety associated with each of several alternate configurations of the LAX North Airfield. Okay, what are the configurations that we were asked to study to assess safety? And there were, in essence, there were 3. Now, one of them, this came out reasonably well. The status quo arrangement basically would have the runways just as they are now. What happens is that planes land, the white arrow means landing, on the outer runway, and they must cross the inner runway at a diagonal en route to the terminals. The inner runway is used for takeoffs. So you see there's a potential for risk when planes that have landed actually are crossing the runway where planes are taking off. In fact, there's something called the horse-to-barn effect. And sometimes the theory is that after a plane has landed after a long flight across the Pacific, people really want to get to the terminal. So they land, they see the terminal, they basically just throttle on right through this very dangerous intersection, at which they're crossing at an acute angle. The runways are only 700 feet apart. Okay? That's the one configuration. On the other hand, the newest technologies, including runway status lights, which start blinking and burning very brightly if you try to enter a runway which is being used by another plane. So there are new technologies, including radar systems and runway status lights, and they already exist on the South Airfield of LAX. The assumption is they will soon be on the North Airfield. Now, there's another one that would create on the North Airfield a mirror image of what we have on the South Airfield. And what happens is a plane lands, and then it leaves the arrival runway, and it goes onto a centerline taxiway, the line in orange, and it slows down considerably on the centerline taxiway, and then it crosses the takeoff runway at a right angle. And as we know from driving, with a right angle, you can turn your head and see down to see whether anything is coming, whereas at an acute angle, it's much harder to do so. So by causing the planes to slow down and by giving them greater visibility as they cross the takeoff runway, this, in theory, does provide greater safety. A third option would do the same thing, except that instead of being 800 feet apart, the runways would be 1,040 feet apart. This would allow greater flexibility for handling the big planes, the 747s and now the Airbus 380, because they could be on the centerline taxiway, you know, until the controllers feel comfortable having them cross the takeoff runway. Okay? What happened was, and I won't go into details now, but there were human-in-the-loop simulations involving pilots and controllers at NASA Ames in August 2009. And it was very interesting. And of course, in these experiments, we did various measures of what happened, but we also had extensive surveys of the pilots and controllers saying, what do you think of this? Some of them landed in some configurations, some of them landed in others, but we asked them a whole set of questions, including how does this compare with the other airports at which you now land? Okay, and as you know, now that we have video games and all, we can understand more what they achieve in the virtual reality, because we had 747 pilots in cockpit simulators, and they saw out the window the equivalent of LAX and the landing under the various configurations, whereas the people in the control tower saw the dots on the screen just as if they were planes about to land at LAX. And it really was quite an extraordinary event. And we looked at the data from that experiment. We looked at all kinds of historical data about runway incursions at LAX and elsewhere, and all kinds of other information. I'm not going to try to describe our estimation procedure now, but in estimating risk, particularly in the baseline case, if anything, we wanted to overestimate. If we want to take a risk, we wanted to take a risk of highballing the estimate rather than lowballing it. Because if we were to wind up saying, for example, that the existing configuration is safe, we really don't want to say that unless we really believe it. And so in estimating various quantities, we did try to pick high estimates rather than low ones. And by the way, our study is available at the LAX website if you look under the keywords North Airfield Safety Study. But let me tell you a little bit about the results now, and tie them a little bit to what we said before. The risk estimates for the various configurations. The first conclusion, which many thought is the most important, or certainly the most controversial, is he said, you know, at 2020 traffic levels and traffic mix, the LAX North Airfield is extremely safe even under the current configuration. Our high-end estimate of the risk per passenger is about 1 in 150 million associated with the risk of runway collisions on the North Airfield. Now, that's a small number, but if we said just now 1 in 32 million is the overall risk of flying of all causes combined, you know, when you think about it, getting a number like 1 in 150 million for this particular source of risk is not really that rare. It's not really that outlandish. Actually, as I said, we really felt that if you had to get an estimate that was on average right rather than sort of a high-end estimate, it would have been several factors lower than that. Okay? Now, as far as the proposals to create new configurations, the ones that would move the runways further apart and create a centerline taxiway, look, of course the people are not crazy. They would reduce by a substantial percentage the risk of a runway collision. And we tried through various means to estimate the extent of the reduction, and in percentage terms it was relatively high. For the 100 North configuration, it would reduce the mortality risk by 40%. For the 340, it would reduce it by 55%. Okay? So in other words, we start out with a certain risk level, and we say that for the reasons people thought, we do believe risk wouldn't disappear, but it would diminish if the runways were further apart. Then the next point, though, we said, now look, it's true you'd get something like a 50% reduction in risk, but if a number is incredibly small, even reducing it by 50% might not mean that much. really. You know, if someone told you, I have a device that will reduce deaths on the escalator by 50%, it costs $1 billion, you might say, I didn't know there were any deaths on the escalator. And the person said, oh yeah, once every century we have a death on an escalator, and we could reduce that to once every 2 centuries. Well, that is 50%, but whether it's worth $1 billion is something one would have to think about. So the percentage, in other words, shouldn't blind us to the fact that it's a percentage of a very small number, okay? And in fact, we try to describe it this way. If we're talking about a decade at LAX at 2020 traffic levels, and this is under the high traffic levels in the future that we were asked to consider, in the baseline case, out of the 750 million passengers, we would expect probably about 80 deaths, 5 of them associated with runway collisions on the North Airfield, 1 in 150 million, so if there were 750, that's 5, and about 75 deaths in other crashes, not just accidents, but we also considered acts of terror. Don't forget on 9/11, 3 of the 4 planes that were felled were headed for LAX. So we said there would have been 80 total deaths. If we went to 100 north, we get a 40% reduction on the runway, so the 5 becomes a 3. The other 75 remains the same, so you're going down from 80 to 78. In other words, you'd save something like 2 lives per decade. Now, obviously, we would prefer to have no deaths, so you'd say, fine, 2 deaths per decade, that's enough. But if it costs $1 billion, you might say, might we not be able to spend the $1 billion in other ways that might save many more than 2 lives per decade? What if it were used, for example, to improve the highway system? The freeways have a little bit been neglected in Southern California and California recently. What if it were used for earthquake protection? We know how important that can be. What if it were used for medical research or cancer research, for example, or for programs to improve safety at the hospitals? In other words, we're not saying that it's irrational to want to save lives, but in a world of finite resources, we have to make choices. And we suggested this was not one of the choices, that aviation has become so safe that sometimes the attempts to improve it marginally may not pass a cost-benefit test. We did say that in terms of capacity, reconfiguring would improve the airport. It would substantially reduce delays and appreciably increase takeoff and landing capacity in peak conditions. And you could make a case for the reconfiguration for moving the runways further apart on grounds related to capacity, and it would improve safety, as we said, the 55%. But we said, if you're going to make that case, let the safety benefits be the icing on the cake rather than the cake itself. You see, this is very important because the mayor explicitly promised he would not support reconfiguration to improve operational efficiency or capacity. He said only safety. Safety was the issue the way it was presented. So finally, we gulped, and here is our final conclusion. We said the panel does not see a compelling case on safety grounds alone for reconfiguring the North Airfield. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you that the finding was not greeted with universal applause. You know, the old mayor of Chicago, the original Mayor Daley, once said, I have been vilified, I have been crucified, I have even been criticized. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been criticized. Let me give you one of the, by far the milder reactions to the study among those who criticized it. The community groups actually loved the study. An amazing thing. People's assessment of the methodological soundness of what we did seemed remarkably correlated with the degree of happiness with our conclusions. But anyway, here's what the Los Angeles Times said. Prompted by demands from City Councilman Bill Rosendahl, airport commissioners ordered the new study despite the existing overwhelming evidence. The tactic worked. The neighbors finally found some experts who agreed with them. Notice the sarcasm there, okay? And then it ended, we're as puzzled as anyone about how airport experts could come to such widely differing conclusions on safety, and we're less convinced about the necessity of separation than we were 2 years ago. But we're certain that the Board of Airport Commissioners should not allow this perplexing study to be the last word on the North Airfield and its troubles. This perplexing study. You know, ladies and gentlemen, when you do a study, you'd like people to say exquisite, sublime, insightful. We got the adjective perplexing. And you know, we pointed out that we didn't really contradict the 5 previous studies, which all said you had to move the runway for safety. They said because we didn't have estimates that differed from theirs because they didn't make any estimates. They basically offered the qualitative point that here's a case where it would be better to have the runways further apart. But they didn't consider how much better. And the community groups, which are very sophisticated in California, in Southern California, said, don't tell us that if you move the runways further apart, it's safer. If you move it 340 feet further apart, it's safer. If you moved it a mile further apart, it will be safer still. What is the magnitude of the risk that is reduced? And we felt we had promised we would estimate the magnitude. None of the others had. You know, they came up with these charts, etc., a green, yellow, red, how you'd move this from the red zone to the green zone. And who's against that? But it was unclear what these zones meant. They had almost no meaning. Anyway, so we had that. The controversy lives on. I might tell you the airport itself is really, and this is not an exaggeration, is doing its best to pretend the study does not exist. I mean, it's still talking about moving the runways further apart, and it gives these arguments about safety as if the study didn't exist. It said the pilot will be able to get a better view of the takeoff traffic. But if they wanted to say that, there was no need for a study. I mean, that was obvious to the beginning. But the point is, ladies and gentlemen, the reason I bring this up is that we are in a situation where aviation is so safe that really the question of what we should do to make it safer, or should we do things to make it safer, is a serious question. And it's not obvious what the answer is. That it's very easy to say, oh, safety is everything. Well, it's not everything where there are other causes of risk. And that leads me to move to the second topic, which I'll mention, which is related to one of my other interests that I actually studied a long, long time ago. And that concerns urban homicide in the United States. And I will talk briefly about the question, is that yesterday's crisis? And you know, I started a long time ago, I'll go back a long ways. I remember the following quote appeared in the New York Times back in 1975. It said, if you live in Detroit, the chances are 2,000 to 1 that you will not be killed by one of your fellow citizens. Optimists searching for perspective in the city's homicide statistics insist that these odds are pretty good. Okay, well, maybe it's perspective, but let me tell you how this statistic came up. It was based on Detroit's annual murder rate, which was 50 per 100,000 in 1974. And 50 per 100,000 is the same as 1 in 2,000. But at the time, I remember thinking, well, wait. A Detroiter is in danger of being murdered throughout his life. And if that's the time frame over which you sustain the risk, maybe that's the time frame over which you should measure the risk. Well, if every year of your life you have a 70-year lifespan, about a 1 in 2,000 risk per year, the total risk of being murdered sooner or later is roughly 70 times 1 in 2,000. Now, that's not literally correct. If you studied probability here, you remember this is not, you don't just take the probability and multiply by the number of possibilities, but the errors in making this approximation are extremely small. Well, 70 over 2,000 is 1 in 28 of ultimately dying of homicide. Okay? And based on this calculation, I and some co-authors estimated in the 1970s that homicide would be the ultimate cause of death of about 1 in 65 urban residents in the United States. Okay? However, these status quo projections basically assume that the murder risk patterns of the 1970s would persist throughout the lifespan of the newborns for that year. So, for example, the risk of passing through age 23 will be approximated by the risk of passing through 23 based on the existing statistics, sort of a snapshot in time. Much as now, when we have life expectancy tables for a newborn, let's say, that we see, they assume that future risks and future mortality patterns will be the same as those now. If, in fact, for example, there's major progress against heart disease or cancer, then the risks might actually go down at certain ages in the future, but they don't assume that. They're saying, if things remain as they are now, what will be the risk? However, in this case, we already know that this assumption has not held, because in recent years, homicide has dropped by about half in the United States. And you might say, well, I was thinking a little over a year ago, what can we say about urban lifetime victimization probabilities now using the present data? In other words, is it possible that while we did have what seemed to be an alarming situation then, things are not nearly as bad as they are based on the most recent data? And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about those. First of all, you know, when you take an average, remember I said an average, the center of mass of the bagel is at the center of the whole. We know that homicide risk varies a great deal by gender and by ethnicity. And under the circumstances, and we're talking about victimization risk now, by the way, the chance of being a murder victim. So I thought, why not do it for 8 major ethnic and gender categories? Hispanic males and females, non-Hispanic white males and females, non-Hispanic black males and females, and Asian American males and females. So for each of these groups, we could work out the risk. And let me tell you what some of the numbers are. If you go through the actuarial calculation, and taking into account, by the way, the variability in lifespan using the latest tables, taking into account the age dependence of risk and quite a few other factors, here are some of the numbers. For the 50 largest U.S. cities, actually 50 out of the 52, we left out New Orleans because the city suffered such a terrible convulsion with Hurricane Katrina. The data for shortly thereafter was not reliable. And also Las Vegas, because the city is merged for police reasons with a lot of the surrounding suburban areas, so it's not really the urban figure for Las Vegas. But 50 out of the 52, ranging from the largest was New York City, the smallest, the 52nd, was Arlington, Texas. But anyway, for these 50 cities, just to give you some overall statistics, the homicide risk for black male, the projection is 1 in 23 will ultimately die of homicide. And this is using the most recent data that we have, because it takes some time to get the data broken down by ethnicity. 1 in 88 for Hispanic males, 1 in 169 for white males, 1 in 322 for Asian males. For females, as you see, the risk levels are a lot lower. 1 in 194 for black females, 1 in 498 for Hispanic females, 1 in 595 white females, 1 in 952 for Asian females, with an overall risk of about 1 in 130. And that, by the way, is about half of 1 in 65. So in other words, the 50% drop in homicides did correspond to a 50% drop in risk. But even after the 50%, I wonder whether we can say that urban homicide is the crisis of the past. You have to remember earlier we were talking about numbers like 1 in 32 million, right? Now we're talking about numbers like 1 in 32. So these are much, much higher numbers. I'll tell you another thing, though, about the risk profile. Of course, there was a big decline since the early 80s, for example, or the late 70s. But I wanted to see, well, where did the decline go? And to compare the 2007 numbers with earlier ones, I decided to focus on the year 1982. Why 1982 is sort of a prior year for comparison? Well, first of all, it's exactly a quarter century before, 25 years. So it wasn't just like a number picked at random. But also, very importantly, it preceded the crack epidemic. The crack epidemic caused a large number of homicides, and the time in which the epidemic reached different cities varied. It's generally believed to have begun toward the mid-'80s and to continue for several years beyond that. And because that could distort comparisons before and after, I thought, let's try to go before the crack epidemic to see where we were, rather than in the midst of what, fortunately, was only a temporary period of the upsurge. And here's another thing we noticed. For the drop in risk, and here I focus only on males, the higher risk gender, and for black males, the risk did go down from 82 to 2007. It went down by about 29%. For Hispanic and white males, let me just say, it's not easy to do the estimation because in 1982, Hispanics were not broken out as a separate group. Most Hispanics, by the way, are classified as white, the overwhelming majority. So in effect, in 82, you had the combined category white, non-Hispanic white plus Hispanic white. But the best guess we could make is that the reduction is something on the order of 60% for both Hispanic and white males. For Asian males, the drop was 71.4%. For blacks and Asians, there was almost no problem because very few Hispanics are classified as either black or Asian. You know what this pattern suggests, though? Treating the middle category as sort of one category rather than two. The lower the lifetime risk in '82, the greater was the percentage drop in lifetime risk between 1982 and 2007. In other words, the groups that were already the safest were the ones that proportionally became safer over the next quarter century. Now, this actually is very highly consequential, because if we had a 29% drop among black males and a 71% drop among Asian males. If we had had that 71% drop among black males as well as Asian males, the black risk would only be a third as great as it actually is. So the tragic situation is that those who were at the greatest risk also saw the lowest reduction in risk over the period. So on the question of whether American urban homicide is yesterday's crisis, I think the answer is obviously not. It continues to be a tragedy of terrible proportions. Now let me end by just making a comparison. I think it's self-evident from these numbers that homicide is a much greater source of mortality risk in the United States than airplane flights. But which source of risk gets greater public attention? You know, when you think about it, we had an introduction where we were told properly that there were some controllers sleeping. And you remember there was a little tear in the fuselage of a Southwest Airlines plane, and this was the subject of all kinds of discussion, including, of course, the late night comics, or something on Saturday Night Live. They had a situation where the flight attendant says, if the oxygen mask comes down for the ceiling because of depressurization, take it. Of course, that assumes there is a ceiling. You know, there was a great deal of discussion, and there is a great deal of discussion about anything that might pose risk in aviation. How much have you seen recently about homicide in the discussion? I don't recall any recent stories about homicide. Homicide is sort of a background tragedy that goes on and on and on, and people don't necessarily know much about it. Now, the truth is, of course, ladies and gentlemen, we ourselves are not at the highest levels of risk implied by these statistics. But still, people around us are. And it seems to me there's something odd that we seem to focus sometimes on low-risk events and pay little attention to risks that are much higher. And you know, this is not the only setting. Let's talk now, and I'm clearly going a little bit beyond my expertise, about nuclear power and the risk it poses. As I understand it, at the moment, and some of you may know more than I do, there were 27,000 deaths in the tragic earthquake in Japan that occurred a little over a month ago. And as far as we know, the number of deaths associated with the radiation problems in the reactor is, if not zero, very close to zero. And the latest projections are that it will remain that way. You know, Chernobyl, of course, was the most tragic event involving a nuclear power plant. And yet, if I understand the studies, and there is controversy, they say that the main consequence of this massive release of radioactivity was an increase in thyroid cancer, which, number one, could have been avoided if the children hadn't drunk milk from the area, and number two, is one of the most curable forms of cancer, thyroid cancer. With iodine, you can largely counteract it. So, in other words, in terms of actual risk, this is not the equivalent of a Hiroshima or Nagasaki. By contrast, in hospitals, mistakes are made. And the question is, how many Americans, for example, die because of mistakes in hospitals? The numbers range from a low of 44,000 to a high of 200,000 per year. This ongoing crisis in the hospitals related to mistakes in the doses and for all kinds of reasons. And the question I would just leave you with is it possible that in the comparison of nuclear power versus hospital errors, much as in the comparison of aviation safety versus homicide, we wind up giving much more attention to the source of low risk than to the source of high risk. And if so, are we making mistakes that have massive consequences? Because our limited resources are being directed against phantoms to some extent, as opposed to against risks that we know are actually there. So I just leave you with that thought. And then I leave this grim topic about mortality risk and say one more thing. Well, we're very, very happy, of course, that you came back to see us. We're glad we have headquarters and facilities that are worthy of your return. And the only other thing is I'd ask you is, well, how are you? Meaning by that, you know, the world is a very strange place. Obviously, the economy and the convulsions associated with various organizations are very great. And that must make it hard and stressful for many of you in your professional lives. I understand that. Of course, I might add that from the perspective of a tenured faculty member, I don't immediately face all the vicissitudes of the marketplace. But I understand that you do. And I won't tell you there's nothing to worry about. It would be extraordinarily inappropriate for me to do that when I myself am not subject to the risk. I can say, though, that I hope that despite the pressures of the job, you are taking the time to do things that you enjoy doing. A little bit of time away from work. You know, there are some people that have sort of a deferred gratification strategy. I'll work very hard now, but then later on I'll be able to retire at 42 on my yacht, etc. So it's terrible today, but it'll be better tomorrow. Anyway, my grandmother used to say, tomorrow never comes. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we should proceed as if tomorrow may never come and make sure that we are enjoying the richness of life today and not being so absorbed, for example, in professional activities that all the other things go by the wayside. You people in the audience are the least appropriate recipients of this advice because you did take the time to come back. No, it's you people on the video I'm speaking to. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, enough of that advice. I want you to know that we are extraordinarily proud of you, and we'll try to continue to behave in ways that will make you proud of us. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer questions if people have them. Yes, sir. I don't know what the arrangements are so that we want to make sure that your questions are heard by the people on the video.
Thank you. Leon Fattal, 1965.
Hi.
Hello. I just wanted to know, where do traffic deaths fit in with the versus homicide and aircraft?
I'm sorry, what fit in?
Traffic.
Oh, you mean auto traffic?
Auto traffic, yeah.
Well, auto traffic, in the United States last year, we had about 33,000 deaths on the road. And that's in comparison, of course, with zero in any kind of plane, by the way, including the regional jets, including the propeller services by commuter flights. Now, homicides, we have about 15,000. But autos are a major source of death. They are not distributed across ethnicities in as lopsided a way as homicide risk is distributed by ethnicity. But based on recent statistics, if you pick a newborn and assume the risk remain even at this level, which is lower than it was some years ago, the chance of ultimately dying in an auto accident is something like 1 in 100. And that's already happening. If we look at mortality statistics, let's say for last year, why did Americans die? You will find that about 1 out of 100 deaths were, well, look, 33,000. We had about 3 million deaths. So that's already 1%. We're already seeing that. So yes, certainly auto fatalities are a real source of risk, and that's another one that we don't hear that much about, do we? Again, sometimes these big risks are sort of treated as background conditions that are there. We don't talk about on a day-to-day basis. Maybe one of the things that happens with aviation is that it's considered unusual. So we hear that one person was asleep. Now, in the full system, that doesn't necessarily pose much risk, but it is unusual. But auto fatal accidents happen every day and don't get attention. Yes, sir? I guess this gentleman.
You talked about the donut effect, and you showed the numbers of the average fatality worldwide. Which are the safer regions? Which are the unsafer regions? And I'm living in Brazil. How much unsafer is flying to Brazil than flying to Los Angeles?
Well, the risk does vary based on region. And Brazil, you see, is a country that's, and forgive me, not that I know much about economics, it wouldn't necessarily be described immediately as one of the world's most developed countries, and yet it is clearly developing very rapidly. And in the last study that I did, and I'd be glad to send you a copy of it electronically, Cross-National Differences in Aviation Safety Records, Brazil itself is sort of in an intermediate group, where the risk is higher statistically than it is in, let's say, the countries of Western Europe or Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, Israel, the United States, etc. So, but it is a lower level of risk than in some of the countries that are associated with less technological development. Brazil, of course, has an unusual history and involvement in aviation, and the Embraer planes that we fly now, the Embraer 190 is a wonderful plane. We fly it here. And of course, you have the new airline Azul, was formed by the founder of JetBlue Airlines here. So Brazil is certainly a place that has worldwide respect for its contributions to aviation. Statistically, it has not done as well. Again, we're talking about rare events, but not as rare as here. You recall, of course, the event at Sao Paulo, and then, of course, there was the tragic mid-air collision, involving the Gol plane before that. And there have been some other events in Brazil, so that statistically, its record at the moment is in a group that is lagging a bit beyond the very best in the world, but it is a record that's improving. If you wanted a number for Brazil, based on, let's say, the first decade of this century, it will be something like 1 in 2 million. So that's where, roughly speaking, the number. But again, Brazil is the kind of place where I would not be surprised to see great improvement very rapidly, which is also happening, for example, in mainland China. Mainland China, when I went to China, they showed me the most modern air traffic control and whatnot. They have in many respects a more advanced aviation system than we have here. And we ourselves in the United States have this extraordinarily good record, although we are not at the forefront of technology. And in fact, one FAA official went to Europe and noticed some of the air traffic control equipment in Europe that he had seen in the United States. But what made him upset was that he saw it in an aviation history museum. Yes, sir?
Thank you. I'm John Starr, 86. Seems like the moral of the story with air travel is don't worry about it. That, that's just not how you're going to die. But I do have a question related to if you've seen any difference between a Boeing product and an Airbus product. Is there any statistics on that?
Yeah, I think, I might add, by the way, that the period I studied, the last 4 years, is one in which we did not suffer any terrorism. Obviously, on 9/11, we did. And we really don't know exactly how to measure the component of risk in aviation associated with terrorism. It certainly seems to be the case, though, that the terrorists are utterly fascinated by aviation, that this fascination long preceded 9/11 and has evidently continued since. So that is a big asterisk. Now, of course, I did take all events over that period, so the reason terrorism wasn't included was there were no events over the 4 years, and that's information in itself. Okay, as far as Airbus versus Boeing, I don't think you could make a serious case that either of them is less safe than the other. They both do an extraordinary job, it seems, in putting together planes that are remarkably safe. And events are extremely rare. And the events that are really tied to, I'm talking about fatal events, that are tied to malfunctions of the aircraft that can be associated with the manufacturers are extraordinarily rare. So I certainly in my own thinking about the subject don't make any distinction. They both do a remarkably good job, it seems to me. We couldn't have the safety record we have if the planes were not built extraordinarily well. Now, for example, in the US, we had one crash in the last 4 years. It was not an Airbus or a Boeing plane. It was actually a prop jet. And even there, it was not necessarily any failure of the manufacturer, as far as we know. It was that the plane went into stall, and the pilots didn't know exactly how to get it out of the stall. So I don't have any statements, except that whenever I hear a plane is Boeing or Airbus, I'm perfectly happy to fly it, and do so all the time, or Embraer, for that matter. Let's see, are there... Yes, sir?
Hi, Scott Weeder, class of '86. So do you see any efforts on the airlines to improve the passenger experience, whether it's security, overcrowding, baggage fees, since the risks seem low as far as mortality? What about focusing on other areas, and what do we need to do to get airlines to do that?
Well, in some sense, that's beyond, that's beyond my domain. You know, I remember when I was at Columbia as an undergraduate, the president of Columbia once said, professors should think twice before offering opinions outside their domain of expertise. And then he said, it may well be that when a professor takes off his academic gown, he wears only the emperor's clothes. Anyway, so in that sense, I don't have any particular expertise. I will tell you, though, that after all is said and done, I think the best thing the airlines can do for us is making sure that we don't have those terrible calls to the next of kin. And I think these other issues are really, I understand what you're saying, but they really are second-order effects. Also, but given that you asked, and it's outside my area of expertise, I question whether or not flying is really less pleasant today, or has to be less pleasant than it was years ago. Now, I don't know whether I should mention particular airlines like JetBlue, in which I own stock, but I went to San Francisco last week, both ways on JetBlue, and I thought the flight was delightful in both directions. You know, there's plenty of, this is so shameful. Why don't I pass a hat around and ask for money? No, but I mean, I think also Southwest has shown itself to be very creative, I think, in trying to get the business traveler. Now you do have, you don't have first come, first served. You just mob at the gate to get the seats. There is a boarding scheme. It doesn't involve advanced seat selection, but for the $10 early bird, you can be one of the first to board. And I find I almost always get the aisle seat in the exit row, which is very, very comfortable. And so I think that some of the airlines are doing, as far as I can tell, an extremely good job in terms of the quality. And we hope that the marketplace will stimulate others to do so. Having said that, I understand what you're saying, and there are times when I'm miserable on the planes. But it's in a way good that we should be miserable about the fact that they're not serving us snacks than to be worried about what's going on in the cockpit, I think. So, you know, when we talk about the golden age of aviation, the golden age was one in which, first of all, the risk was maybe a factor of 10 to 20 to 50 times higher than it is now. And the planes, the propeller planes in the golden age, could not go above turbulence. So the frequency of severe turbulence in flight was much greater than it is now. And so under the circumstances, I think that really this, what did they say in the La Cage aux Folles? The best of times is now, all things considered. I'm happy to take additional questions as long as it's not disrupting. I don't want people to be kept out of lunch, but let's take a few more. Okay, fine. Well, we can play cards then. Yes, sir.
Thank you. David Handmaker, class of '86. Where do you land in Southern California now?
Well, well, actually, there have been times I have deliberately gone out of Long Beach just to take JetBlue, partly because of my annoyance with LAX or my annoyance at the time with American or United or something. But yeah, I can land there because I'm sort of an invisible person. The airport is sort of proceeding as if the study did not exist. However, the community groups are not. And that means if the airport were to try to move the runways further apart, there may be intense opposition to it, because the way it was presented was this will be the sixth study and everyone agrees this will be definitive, the academics will be objective. And then when the results of the study came out, suddenly people, I think, backed away from that position. In fact, here's something interesting. I understand that the week before the study was released, certain people started passing around a letter to community groups, to business groups, to airlines, saying, we don't know what the outcome will be of the study, but whatever it is, we trust the academic panel to have done a good job, and we'll accept the results. Well, the letter was not actually submitted because the community groups refused to sign. They didn't want to give a carte blanche until they had seen the study, and they feared it would go against them. But now that the study came out, we don't have everyone saying, oh, we trust the academic panel to have done a good job. But this is something that happens. You see, if they wanted to make a case that this is good for the economy of Southern California, to make sure LAX is the preeminent airport for traffic to the Pacific, which will be increasingly important. I mean, you could make such a case, and you could say maybe this case is more compelling than the concerns about moving the runway. It would not involve the demolition of any homes, by the way, if they move the runway. It would involve demolishing a few businesses, including an In-N-Out Burger, and I myself am a vegetarian, so that itself doesn't strike me as a tragedy necessarily. But the point is that you can make a case for this expansion, but I don't think you can make that case solely on safety grounds, because we tried very hard to estimate the level of risk associated with it. Anyway, I have, however, landed at LAX without incident since then. And I mean, I don't mean to speak against the airport, having said that, having done that for 20 minutes, because no other airport in the world has actually gone to such extremes of saying, let's have a scientific study to resolve the question instead of just a bitter clash of conjectures. So, I mean, I have enormous respect for them, but they have difficulty accepting our results. And, you know, one of the things some people would sort of say to us is, well, you know, the academics can come up with their results, then they go back to their ivory towers, and others have to live with the risks. And I pointed out, you know, we put our reputations on the line, in effect, and saying LAX North is extremely safe. If God forbid anything terrible were to happen tomorrow at LAX, among other things, our reputations would be ruined. So it's not that we have no stake in what we said. We believe in it, and we were ready to take risks associated with it. Anyway, but I don't urge anyone to boycott LAX. It's an airport which is now on the rebound after a period of great decline over the first decade of the 20th century. Let's see. You had your hand up, sir. Oh, I see.
So a friend of mine has recently got his private pilot's license, and invited me to go along for a flight, and I've been wondering just how big a risk I would be taking if I go with him.
Well, tell me more about your friend.
Yeah.
I imagine it depends a great deal on who the friend is. If it's a person who seems risky in driving on the ground, who says that nothing is cooler than driving the wrong way on a freeway, then I wouldn't. But statistically, private aviation is much riskier than commercial aviation. But again, that reflects, you know, different levels of experience, et cetera, different capabilities of the small planes, and do people understand their limitations? So so in a particular case, you wouldn't necessarily know. For example, Captain Sullenberger was here recently. Captain Sullenberger was the one who landed his plane in the Hudson in that heroic demonstration of how safe it is to fly now. And he flies a private plane. So if he were to say he's going up in a private plane, I would certainly go up with him. He has not invited me. Were there other questions about friends and foes? Yes, sir.
Just a comment. I flew in on US Air, and our flight was delayed because there was a mechanical issue, and the pilot asked for us to hold on to tarmac until a mechanic came and checked it out, which caused a delay. But once we got to our connecting flight, which I missed because we were delayed, they had reported it as an air traffic issue, although it was mechanical, which leads me to question validity of some of the statistics that may be provided to you by the airlines, because they have other interest in taking fault at some of the things that they do. So to what extent do you think these falsifications would have impact some of the studies that you've done, or have you looked at falsifications that they may have?
You know, there are some things you can falsify. And in particular, you can't conceal a fatal accident, for example. So the kinds of statistics I use, I believe, are highly reliable. That's true both of homicide and of aviation. That the homicide is believed to be the crime which is most accurately reported. For some of these other crimes, there's a question of whether people will report the crime. And there are underreporting biases of various kinds. But for aviation, in terms of safety, I don't think there's an issue. And I can tell you, in the study about runway risk at LAX, we looked at these statistics from the FAA, which indicated that runway mishaps were diminishing very sharply. But then we basically said, is it possible that there's a kind of grade deflation going on, that something that would be considered very serious years ago is considered less serious now? But then I'd give the same answer I just gave you, namely, fatal events, no one can disguise in any way. And in the previous decade, let's say the 1990s, there were 6 fatal events on the runways in the US. In the last decade, there was 0. So in that sense, we believe that the fatal accident data correspond to the data about non-fatal events. So I don't think that's an issue in the studies that I have. And you know, the only thing I can say about US Airways is it's possible it was a combination of the mechanical and the ATC, the air traffic control. It may be that they were delayed departing because of the mechanical issue, but then air traffic congestion made it impossible to make it up in some way. So I don't know whether or not they were totally lying, but you may know better than I, knowing the circumstances. Let's see. Well, hands up, sir, in the back. Thank you.
Hi, Pedro Miranda, class of 2001. I was wondering how much unsafer you think private aviation is. I got a quote for insurance, life insurance, and usually they carve out private aviation. If you ask them to include that, it's about 80% more expensive, the premium.
I'm not surprised to hear that, because I think the statistics are consistent with a greater risk. Again, if it's private aviation, you'd want to know much more about the specifics of who is providing the aviation. I know we have, for example, not that I can ever afford it, but things like NetJets, and they say that they have stellar maintenance and highest caliber pilots, and I certainly have no information to contradict that. But I think that the insurance probably relates to the actuarial reality that the risk is greater in various kinds of private aviation. Okay. Yes, ma'am?
So, I mean, I think even the questions we're seeing, that we're focusing on the lower risk of and not talking a lot about our homicide risk.
Yes, I've noticed that too.
And living sort of in Brooklyn, where maybe a couple blocks away there's murders happening, but not, it's interesting. We don't think about, oh, that's only a mile away, and there's that being reported. And so I was wondering if you've been doing any collaboration with either, I know that there's some person on decision making and sort of our irrationality, or any psychologist, because this is, I think, very interesting how we do look at risk and what do we do focus on and what we kind of pretend to ignore.
Well, I myself grew up in Brooklyn, as I mentioned in connection with the air crash, and I know Brooklyn has had a terrible period when Brooklyn had 800 homicides a year in Brooklyn alone. In fact, Myrtle Avenue was supposedly renamed Murder Avenue because of the magnitude of the problem. You know, I guess the answer to your question is, I haven't been that much involved directly with policymakers. I have tried to disseminate these results. I mean, for example, if you have results like this about the magnitude of the homicide problem, that doesn't immediately imply what you should do to reduce it. What I try to do is to provide statistical information that might be relevant to policymakers. Let me give an example. There is the broken windows theory that was advanced by Professor James Q. Wilson, a very eminent criminologist and social scientist who was at Harvard for a while. And this theory that he advanced with Detective Kelling was that in a neighborhood where there are broken windows that are not repaired, it conveys a certain sense of lawlessness. And if you have one broken window that's not repaired, soon you have more broken windows. And ultimately, basically, the idea is that by not taking seriously the minor crimes, you actually create an environment in which the major ones are more likely. And this theory has been used to explain some of the reduction in homicide, why, for example, New York had such a big reduction under Mayor Giuliani. And that might be perfectly true. One thing, though, we need to remember is that, you know, there are very few broken windows in Asian neighborhoods. And these are the areas that had the biggest decline in homicide. So that raises the question, what happened there? Is there anything we can learn from what happened there, where the reductions were the greatest, that we might be able to use in trying to reduce homicide in the other communities? Now, I'm not the person who is most able to think about that or to help with that transition. The way I can try to help is simply by pointing out what the statistics say. And that's about as far as I go to some, you know, with these things. I hope it's helpful. That the idea is the more facts you have on the table, I think, the better able you are to make sensible decisions that reduce problems. That itself is something of an axiom. But I haven't worked directly with psychologists or police departments. I mean, I have to some extent interacted with them, but probably not to the extent that, let's say, people who volunteer for many of these organizations do. Yes, sir?
Paul Drew, class of 96. This might be outside your area of expertise, but I'm wondering if the economic impact of the delays and all the expenses associated with the TSA really reduce the risk of terrorism, and is it justified by reducing the deaths?
Well, that's a fair question about security, and I have actually done some work on security and have been part of some of the debates. The New York Times has these online debates about security. Personally, I believe I support all the measures that are being taken now. I don't like them. Believe me, we've all gone through, haven't we, the new machines, etc., where at the last moment they say, wait, just a second, you left your handkerchief in your pocket. But it seems to me that the more options we take off the table for the terrorists, the more they are driven to desperate measures that have a lesser chance of success. You know, it's very easy to ridicule the idea that you have to take your shoes off at the airport. From what I understand, the attempted sabotage against American Flight 63 from Paris to Miami was really a very close call. That the explosives got on board and that they were very potent explosives. And he was sitting at a seat. He waited until the person next to him left for the lavatory, and then he lit a match. And had he succeeded in igniting his shoes, the plane might have been lost. So when you realize there can be that kind of hazard with shoes, I'd say if you simply say, well, we can't ask everyone to take their shoes off, then that hazard remains there. But now we do take our shoes off. So I would think the would-be terrorist would not really use that as a mechanism. So the next thing you know, they wind up with someone in the underwear. And of course there, the chances of success are less. The attempt with the underwear bomber failed. And now, of course, we try to reduce the risk of bombs in the underwear through these new detectors. Okay, will they try something else? Will they try something else now that the liquid explosives cannot be used as easily? The fact is we haven't had terrorist events against aviation, at least here in the United States, really since 9/11. And that's not because of lack of interest on the part of the terrorists. So I think, from my point of view, that these methods may be contributing toward greater safety. We can never prove it. It's hard to prove a negative. But I would say if we have to wait 5 minutes more at the airport, and look, I feel the annoyance just the way you do. But nonetheless, I think I'd rather we do that, particularly given that if aviation terrorism is successful, the ramifications go beyond aviation. What if the 9/11 terrorists had been stopped at the airport? Who knows? We might not be in 2 or 3 wars at this moment. So I personally put enormous priority on trying to improve aviation safety and security, I mean to say. And I think that the measures that have been taken are not out of proportion to the potential catastrophe. Okay, in other words, the risk is very low in aviation. I can say we pretty much mastered the forces of nature, thunderstorms or icing. We have not necessarily mastered the forces of evil, which can forever change their methods of attack. And so I don't think that the security at the moment is excessive. And I have taken that position in these online debates. And I might assure you I've gotten some very extraordinarily negative comments about it, including, he's at MIT? Or another one said warmly, when I read what Barnett said, I vomited. Anyway, are there a yes, sir?
Hi, Avner Halperin, Sloan Fellow 2001.
Hi.
Hi. Have you done any statistical analysis on the racial breakdown of death on air traffic? I would guess that it would be more slanted toward white. And if so, then obviously this suggests something about our public debate and what causes interest in public debate, and maybe that's something that should be put on the table.
Well, I think your intuition is correct, that to the extent that flying is largely an activity of the middle and the upper middle class, even though flying is more democratic than it was years and years ago because of lower fares, nonetheless, I would say there probably is a socioeconomic bias, you could say. And I think, look, I don't want to say anything glib here that goes beyond anything I personally can say, but it is true that, look, when we hear about problems in the air, it frightens us. It frightens me. You know, when we hear about, oh my goodness, this could happen to me, this could happen to my daughter, for example, and we don't necessarily think the same way of homicide. We know homicide is a tragic problem and a big problem, but somehow at a gut level, I don't think we in this room necessarily have an active fear of becoming murder victims. And might that difference in perceptions on the part of the readers affect in some way the way reporting is done? I don't know. I mean, now, for example, I've noticed you go on the web, you see a news story, and at the end it'll say, rate this story. You know, give it a like or dislike. And you know, this is sort of bizarre, the way that market forces may influence what we are told and what we focus on. So if you're bringing up something that might be worrisome, I can only say, as a non-expert in that area, that I share your worry. Okay, I think our time is up. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope your flights back and your stay here are wonderful.